So we are ready to start our first panel, which we've titled US-Russian Relations and the Threat to Strategic Stability. We have made the decision that we will keep our introductions to the panelists relatively brief, and you will see that you have a full package of bios, so you can read up on all their expertise. But as Paul was saying we have assembled so many excellent speakers that we have no time to read out all their credentials at the start of every panel. So I will introduce the two first speakers relatively briefly. Ernie Regehr is a Senior Fellow in Defense Policy and Arctic Security at the Simons Foundation of Vancouver and also a Research Fellow at the Center for Peace Advancement at the Conrad Grebel University College, the University of Waterloo. He is also, and this is important in this context, a co-founder and former executive director of Project Plowshares. And then the second speaker is Nancy Teeple, who is an adjunct assistant professor and research associate at the Department of Political Science at the Royal Military College of Canada. Her research areas are also extremely pertinent to what we are doing at this conference. They include nuclear strategy and deterrence, nuclear non-proliferation and arms control, and also Arctic security. So we have given the speakers about 15 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions and answers. And Ernie, will you please take us away?
Great, thanks so much, and thanks to you and to Paul for the invitation. I think it's, and am I going through? I think it's appropriate that we start this for the day off with a kind of broad review of the strategic environment, and I thought I would do that by looking at a number of parliamentary studies that took place during this past parliamentary session, the 42nd, which of course is now ended, and look at the reports that those committees put out, which had some impinged upon some attention to the strategic environment. I won't, there are a fair number of them actually, which says something itself, the amount of interest that there was in the question. And I won't take part of my 15 minutes to describe, to list those all, except to say that the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee, the Defense Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee issued more than a half dozen of reports on subjects like NATO, NORAD, Canada-US relations with Eastern Europe, and the Arctic, and all of those touched in some manner on the strategic environment, and particularly on relations with current relations with Russia. And it will not be a surprise that these Canadian parliamentary studies registered a dominant posture of wariness toward Russia. That may be a bit understated. Strongly rebuking it on Ukraine. But they also showed a lot of interest in finding constructive ways out of the current stalemate. It should, and also needs to be noted that the attitudes on the committees shifted somewhat as the focus or context shifted from the Ukraine to the Arctic. In both cases, still addressing strategic relations, but with a little different approach to them. Testimony offered in the European context was solidly rooted in attention to Russia's military adventurism. That's the term used by Canada's ambassador to NATO, and was really a central image. Other threats to security and stability were addressed, but Russian behavior was a dominant framework. Nevertheless, within that framework, the testimony included significant references to a range of mitigating considerations when looking at Russia. Some witnesses referred to the Russian sense that NATO's continuing expansion violated the mutual restraint commitments and recognition of legitimate Russian security interests that were promised in the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act. There were assessments that Russian remilitarization is really a struggling effort, an effort to just reverse 2 decades of neglect, with radically diminished budgets available. And some argued that Russia's conventional military capacity is in any event largely directed toward an anti-access and area denial defensive strategy, not focused particularly on force or power projection. The Defense Committee's report on NATO pointed to what it called Russian and Chinese willingness, and I'm quoting, willingness to use force to achieve their foreign policy objectives, and identified that willingness as a direct challenge to the international order. A very good point. I only would have thought it appropriate for parliamentarians to have also noted that Russia and China are not the only perpetrators of the willingness to use force for foreign policy ends. Some of the place names might be Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and you know, the list carries on. In the North American context, the resurgent Russian strategic bomber patrols were raised as a potential threat. The Defense Committee noted an average of 5, and this isn't information that gets out a lot, but it noted an average of 5 NORAD intercepts per year since 2007, which doesn't quite seem like a surge to me, but the point was the potential for those patrols to escalate, of course. Ballistic missile proliferation was commonly referred to, and particularly the emergence of advanced cruise missiles in Russia's arsenal was identified as especially dangerous. But the Defense Committee's NORAD report did not stray from the now long-standing assessment that Canada and North America do not face a state-based military threat. That judgment came from the Canadian Armed Forces, but with the warning that conditions can change and intentions can change quickly as well. Witnesses had various perspectives on the extent of the Russian threat in the Arctic, but there were some assessments that current Russian military deployments in the Arctic really represent a threefold, a largely defensive, and as I mentioned earlier, anti-access aerial denial strategy. One particularly military concern for Russia in the Arctic is the protection of sovereignty and territorial integrity on its northern coast. Second, the buildup of protection and infrastructure, and protecting the infrastructure for the northern sea route, which will get progressively more action. And then finally, the protection of the Barents Sea bastion for the Russian SS Envia missile carrying arsenals of the Russian Navy. The committee heard testimony in Washington urging the pursuit of technologies to break through the defenses, even urging an anti-submarine warfare role for Canada in the area. But that does really beg the question of why, and of the security implications of the U.S. and Western forces threatening the deterrent forces of Russia and trying to make them vulnerable. Some witnesses certainly insisted the Arctic is becoming a dangerous geopolitical environment with potential threats to Canadian sovereignty and security. But the recommendations that ensued from that assessment did not call for extraordinary measures in response. Instead, there were calls to modernize the North Warning System. That's a long-established intention on the part of Canada, and some planning has been done on that. It'd be very expensive. Call to enhance situational awareness in the region, improve ice-breaking capacities, and to provide Canadian Rangers with the maritime capabilities as well. All such measures are consistent with defined security requirements in the Canadian and Arctic, and are not particularly focused on state-based military threats. The emphasis was instead on countering terrorism, on extremist manifestations in a newly accessible region, to bolster search and rescue and disaster response, and generally to perform what are more like constabulary duties and support to civilian authorities, in much the same way that Canadian forces function today. One question of NATO, on the question of NATO in the Arctic, there was some caution and concern about exacerbating tensions in the region that way. Some witnesses insist that the Arctic is still a region of cooperation, and the entry of NATO would destabilize that. But the Defense Committee did in fact propose greater NATO involvement. It called on Canada to seek a specialized Arctic role within NATO, without defining what that might be, and that Canada host NATO exercises in the Arctic. The government generally agreed with the committee, but did not promote a NATO institutional presence in the Arctic. The recommendations related to strategic stability coming out of these studies tended to support re-engagement and dialogue with Russia, as well as military restraint and arms control. In that sense, it was similar to a recent Norwegian study, which was quite alarmist about and expressed a lot of deep concern about the strategic developments in the Arctic and in Northern Europe, calling it a new Cold War in the region. But the same study then warns of military responses, and that would further aggravate the strategic uncertainty. The authors conclude that any moves to strengthen outside one side's defense will appear offensive from the other side, pushing the spiral upward and drawing attention to security issues at the expense of other issues in the area. With military options so fraught with danger, the dialogue becomes the focus. A recognition that strategic stability is politically constructed, not militarily imposed. And the parliamentary committees generally, though not always, called for dialogue, the preferred alternative to dialogue being sanctions rather than military action. Foreign Affairs Committee report on Eastern Europe called for, I'm quoting, multilateral efforts including the OSCE, NATO and the UN and other international institutions to bring about a resolution to Russia's military invasion and illegal annexation of Crimean territory, and logistical and military support for the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine. The same committee's April 2019 report on the Arctic called on the government to work with its partners in the North Atlantic Council to deepen the alliance's understanding of Russia's military intentions in the Arctic and to consider the most appropriate and measured response. It argued for keeping the temperature down and for keeping avenues for cooperation open. There was a call on the government to continue to work with Russia whenever possible through the Arctic Council in concert with other member states. Security, and then there was a list of areas of cooperation, and security arrangements were not on that particular list of potential cooperation, but the government explicitly referred to security cooperation in its response. And I'm quoting now, the Government of Canada believes that cooperation and collaboration should continue to define how we operate in the Arctic, including on Arctic security issues. Arctic nations have long agreed to resolve disputes peacefully in accordance with international law, and a reference really to the Ilulissat Declaration from 2008 and renewed in 2018. Senate Special Committee on the Arctic also heard calls for cooperation and dialogue on Arctic security, implicitly calling for an end to the post-Crimea impulse to withhold engagement. Hence, the Senate Committee recommended that, and I'm quoting, that to ensure regional stability and facilitate information sharing, the Government of Canada should establish a forum dedicated to Arctic security issues involving the participation of all Arctic states. Well, finally, the arms control and disarmament reference in the committee came in the Defense Committee's review of NATO. And it was a good one, implicitly recognizing arms control and disarmament as key tools for advancing strategic stability. It recommended, and I'll quote at length here, that the Government of Canada take a leadership role within NATO in beginning the work necessary for achieving the NATO goal of creating the conditions for a world free of nuclear weapons. That this initiative be undertaken on an urgent basis in view of the increasing threat of nuclear conflict flowing from the renewed risk of nuclear proliferation, the deployment of so-called tactical nuclear weapons, and changes in nuclear doctrines regarding lowering the threshold for the first use of nuclear weapons by Russia and the US. Well, it was a somewhat surprising proposal in a largely cautious report that focused more on the nuts and bolts of alliance membership. But of course, the committee had the benefit of some very effective testimony in support of the nuclear disarmament activism, some of those who testified being here today. The government response then is interesting. It agreed with the recommendation, calling nuclear disarmament a priority for the government, and then made it clear that it regarded current policy and action as fully meeting the intent of the recommendations and implied that there would be no new initiative or action. It reviewed what it said was NATO's long record of support for nuclear disarmament, declared NATO's nuclear arrangements to be fully consistent with the NPT, and restated Canada's priority commitment to negotiating the FMCT in the moribund Conference on Disarmament, and recalled Canadian participation in the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification. The committee's recommendation was obviously proposing that Canada take new initiatives, breathe new energy into its NACD efforts, and that these be undertaken with a sense of urgency. But what it got really was six paragraphs of a commitment to business as usual, epitomized by the declaration that FMCT negotiation would stay within the deadlocked CD. The CD really having become the arms control world's most potent symbol of unwavering commitment to inaction. The government's response is disappointing for obvious reasons, but it also represents a failure to recognize the centrality of arms control to the effective management of the strategic environment. And given the current precarious state of that environment, failure to understand the urgency of employing arms control and disarmament as tools for pursuing strategic stability is doubly disappointing. Two more paragraphs. Overall, the parliamentary committee did useful work in giving attention to the current East-West malaise and in encouraging an approach towards Russia that, while remaining firm on the violations to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, promotes dialogue and the pursuit of diplomatic conversations and accommodations that are needed to move beyond the entrenched stalemate over Crimea. I think one further takeaway from these reports is that they suggest Canadians generally, in as much as parliamentarians are representative of Canadian values, would be supportive of a more activist Canadian role in promoting dialogue and the diplomatic exploration of ways to recover some of the cooperative spirit that prevailed in the first decade of this century, reflected in Minister Ouellette's statement at the NPT, a spirit more conducive to curtailing the arms racing we now face. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will hand it straight over to Nancy Teeple, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Thank you to SIPS and to Pugwash for inviting me to this amazing forum.
Excuse me, could you speak closer to the microphone?
Hold the microphone.
Speak closer to the microphone.
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to Pugwash and SIPS for inviting me to this forum. So it's no surprise that relations between the United States and Russia are at an all-time low. Tensions inducing issues involve the following, as discussed: the confrontation between NATO and Russia in Eastern Europe, and the condemnation of Russia's actions in Eastern Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, the ambiguity surrounding Russia's execution of gray war, kinetic and non-kinetic activities, not only focused on Baltic populations, but interfering in public opinion in domestic affairs of states, the nuclear modernization programs involving upgrades and new systems, including the deployment of missile defense systems in Europe and plans to enhance national missile defense in the United States. And of course, the deterioration of arms control, particularly the INF Treaty and also the JCPOA, and the potential that New START would not be renewed past 2021. So this raises a number of questions. How did we get here? What are the conditions contributing to increasing tensions, and what are the dangers? So this presentation looks at the nuclear security dilemma between Russia and the United States, the strategic stability debate, the impact of deterrence by denial involving offensive systems on strategic relations, and issues for consideration for future engagement and dialogue. My discussion will raise more questions and doesn't provide any easy answers, and hopefully this will generate debate and ideas for solution within this forum. So the U.S.-Russia relations involves an intensifying nuclear security dilemma that Ernie had alluded to, the spiraling of arms races. It was like during the Cold War, but more intense today, as we'll see. Tensions between Russia and the West waxed and waned since the end of the Cold War, and a number of incidents contributed to the degradation of relations, namely, since 1999, the NATO mission in Kosovo, NATO enlargement, and the U.S. abrogation of the ABM Treaty in 2002 with plans to modernize the nuclear triad. Challenges today include a context defined that is distinct from the Cold War, but reminiscent of some of the tensions. The United States and Russia are again nuclear peer competitors, as they both possess the largest nuclear arsenals compared to other nuclear nations. However, emerging competitors like China, in addition to what I call revisionist states with nuclear ambitions, formerly known as rogue states, these interfere with the bilateral relationship, i.e. when the United States develops a capability to respond to the emerging threat from China or North Korea, Russia may perceive this as posing a threat to its strategic forces, thus causing it to respond by developing weapons that asymmetrically target the weaknesses of Western nuclear and non-nuclear forces. So these intervening third-party variables complicate the security dilemma, creating more obstacles to achieving and maintaining strategic stability. And as a concept itself, strategic stability was never fully agreed upon. A general understanding is no incentives to use nuclear weapons, to strike first, or develop offensive denial nuclear capabilities to undermine a competitor state's second strike. However, the concept remains ambiguous regarding the scope and content of the term. James Acton, for instance, discusses how varying concepts of strategic stability were often applied based on the national security interests of the state employing it, in terms of its requirements for strategic stability, broadening or narrowing the scope and content of the concept. Notably, James Acton argues that strategic stability as a catch-all term that tries to capture every possible motive for using nuclear weapons first tends to obscure the reasons why strategists disagree and thus confuses the debate. This makes it challenging to engage in nuclear policy debates for which scholars and experts call for clarification. And I would say challenges the dialogue between the West and Russia on such matters. So recently, I don't know if anyone is aware of this report that came out of Russia. It was released this month and addresses Russia's perspectives on strategic stability and concerns moving forward on improving U.S.-Russia strategic relations. This report was produced by Russia's National Research University's Higher School of Economics, entitled "The New Ways of Understanding and Ways to Strengthen Multilateral Strategic Stability." And this was explicitly stated to be supported by the Russian Foreign Ministry, the State Duma, and the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. The report indicates that the state of strategic stability today is more complex and less manageable. It states that the fundamentally new and complex strategic situation requires a new definition and understanding of the term strategic stability and new approaches towards reducing the risk of nuclear war. Notably, this report argues that challenges to strategic stability today are rooted in the military strategic landscape, which makes previous understanding of strategic stability obsolete.
How to access this report?
Sure, I can give you the URL at the end if you want. I can give you the link at the end if you'd like.
I think I'm not the only person who might benefit.
Certainly, yes. So the situation makes traditional arms limitation mechanisms ineffective and senseless, according to Russia. The report blames the United States for destroying the arms control structure in order to win a nuclear war. It is concerned with the deployment of non-nuclear weapons with strategic properties, and these are stated as the following, of course. We're familiar with high-precision weapons, long-range conventionally armed missiles, missile defense systems, space-based, primarily satellite and eventually laser weapons, and of course cyber weapons. The blurring of strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons, they say, risks nuclear escalation. The report also argues that the emergence of nuclear multipolarity, particularly China's nuclear arsenal, undermines the logic of Russia-US bilateral arms control. Notably, the report also criticizes the decline of competence in the responsibility among Western elites and a growing strategic parasitism, which they describe as a no end to peace and reduced public resistance to military policies. Interestingly, the report also addresses factors that Russia perceives to increase strategic stability, and these would undoubtedly contrast with the perceptions of the United States and the West. These are the following. The newest Russian weapons, these supposedly destabilizing weapons, guarantees its second strike and is thus stabilizing. The second being a new strategic partnership between Russia and China, creating trust. Creates a trust that Russia sees an increase in China's nuclear capabilities does not threaten Russia, so that's an interesting development. And thirdly, the strengthening of asymmetric deterrents amid waning transparency provides weaker countries the ability to deter militarily stronger states using the factor of uncertainty. These statements are not policy, but strongly reflect Russian perspectives that impact policy and strategy. The U.S., in contrast, especially outlined in the 2018 NPR, demonstrates a preoccupation with absolute security, in which mutual vulnerability does not play a role, where missile defenses and denial systems provide the United States and NATO with strategic advantage through counterforce dominance. So how can the United States and Russia achieve strategic stability when both nations keep talking past one another? How can arms control and strategic stability be achieved? In terms of conditions facilitating strategic stability, a number of questions need to be considered. Do we need strategic stability in order to cooperate on arms control? What sort of conditions precede new arms control or extend or expand current arms control treaties? Do effective arms control negotiations and agreements require a crisis to get key players to realize that a dangerous situation could escalate from a conventional to a nuclear war? And the challenge facing us moving forward are the determinants, essentially the conditions that lead to arms control. And this is what is kind of like a chicken and egg situation as I'm posing these questions to you. Do arms control agreements increase strategic stability, or do we need strategic stability to cooperate on arms control? But let's assume that they're mutually reinforcing. Challenges to arms control and strategic stability are essentially the development of these destabilizing capabilities. Technologies designed for deterrence by denial, understood as offensive forces. It's important to understand the provocative role that these kinds of systems play in contributing to strategic instability, resulting in arms races with our primary adversaries. Strategic doctrine and weapon systems emphasizing deterrence by denial, challenges moving forward on new arms control, extending arms control treaties, and as we've seen, has contributed to the deterioration of long-standing agreements such as the INF Treaty. Perceptions are involved in these in how these offensive capabilities are understood as threatening. So these are systems that are designed with enhancements for strategic advantage. Modernization, upgrades, and enhancements to nuclear arsenals, in this case, involve weapons that are perceived as increasingly threatening as they're deployed for first strike advantage. These generally are understood as weapons with increased stealth, speed, precision, accuracy, and low or high yield. Recent developments in new offensive systems include cruise missiles enhanced with stealth, longer ranges, and hypersonic vehicles. Deterrence by denial pursued with conventional counterforce alternatives is creating an entanglement of conventional capabilities within the nuclear architecture. This includes Russia and China's having integrated its command and control with nuclear and conventional systems. Entanglement essentially blurs the boundaries between nuclear and conventional, potentially increasing the risk of miscalculation. Enhancing missile defenses are being pursued for ultimate defense against ballistic missiles, and now the U.S. is exploring options for defending against new cruise missiles. These cruise missiles that can evade detection and interception. Options for both what is called left and right of launch are also being explored within an integrated concept that includes layered systems, enhanced with sensors and radars, and non-kinetic capabilities such as cyber and electronic warfare. In response to these developments, Russia pursues multiple projects for missile defense defeating capabilities to fill this asymmetric gap, and these include hypersonics like the Avant-Garde that you've heard of, as well as the most recent Vyrazvestnik test that failed. Tsirkon hypersonic cruise missile. They're exploring heavily MIRVed ICBMs and new ICBMs such as the Sarmat, and of course this idea of this autonomous undersea vehicle, the so-called Poseidon. So these planned capabilities have been met with varying levels of Western officials taking them seriously. However, one analyst I know maintains that as Russia's tests fail, they learn. They learn what works until they succeed. So moving forward in improving U.S.-Russia relations, this requires a dialogue, engagement, and an understanding of perceptions of one another's intentions. Engagement on nuclear nonproliferation and arms control requires establishing a dialogue with our adversaries on the dangers of abandoning arms control and start addressing the problem posed by the nuclear conventional entanglement, advances in cruise missiles and hypersonic technology, and substrategic nuclear weapons. The issue poses this question, how do you establish a dialogue that has been shut down as the tensions rise? Provocative statements by leaders about having superior capabilities and being willing to use them does not incentivize either state to come to a discussion. The beginning of facilitating conditions for dialogue requires an understanding of the perceptions of each state, particularly how certain weapon systems are perceived as threatening and how certain doctrine is perceived as threatening. This issue includes uncertainty about one another's actual capabilities and intentions. So this requires communication. Entanglement is viewed as particularly destabilizing because it creates uncertainty in the perceptions of states in distinguishing nuclear from non-nuclear weapons in a conflict, and I want to reinforce that. Thank you. Engagement and dialogue could address limiting dangerous weapon systems. In light of the challenges posed by advances in cruise missile technology, there might be room for considering limiting certain developments that make those weapons more threatening, such as hypersonics, and perhaps limiting some missile defense capabilities. Also, part of the dialogue could be limiting tactical nuclear weapons, and it's time we started addressing these. Ultimately, in a strategic competition where one state has strategic advantage over the others, unilateral action, such as reductions or elimination of a threatening system, would have to be made to incentivize other states to consider cooperating on further reductions in nuclear forces. And this unilateral action, I would suggest, would have to be taken on by the stronger state because the weaker state would have less incentive to extend an olive branch. However, I'll leave off with this thing that happened. A few days ago, Russia recently proposed to NATO a moratorium on the deployment of intermediate and medium-range missiles in Europe and other regions. Coming at this from a place of weakness, so we wonder why this is happening. NATO does not view this proposal as credible, however, particularly due to the 9M729 cruise missile, which NATO argues was the cause of the demise of the INF Treaty. One must consider then, what are Russia's intentions? Are they seeking to mend relations in light of the failure of the Birovesnik tests in Neonoxa? Or is this to put the United States on the spot about the deployment of the Aegis Ashore system that it argues that also violates the INF Treaty? So I thought I'd pose a number of these questions to you and generate more questions, more debate, and maybe solutions to some of these problems. But I wanted to put these issues out there for you to think about. Thank you very much.
I'm from the University of British Columbia. I'm the one who bought the rain here. It's my pleasure to host this, be the moderator for this panel. We'll start by Peggy Mason, talking about her thing, and then Marius. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And it's a very great pleasure to be here, and I'm thankful to be invited. And our focus, of course, is middle power role with respect to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But I want to start with a reference to the United Nations. I want to start with a statement issued by the European Leadership Network Group, kind of eminence grise, to all of the leaders gathering at the UN General Assembly. Quote, simply coercing an adversary will not restore stability. Politically unrealistic appeals for transformed behavior will not build trust. An accelerating arms race makes both trust and safer behaviors harder to achieve. It is possible to negotiate with adversaries without condoning unacceptable behavior. Leaders must relearn the skills of past decades in finding ways to reduce shared nuclear risks in the absence of wider trust. And as Ernie, end quote, as Ernie mentioned in his panel, it is the quintessential role of the middle power to find every possible way to promote dialogue, because, not despite, the tensions. A role, alas, that Canada has seemingly forgotten, because we cite rising tensions. The minister, in her letters to NGOs, as we talk about the need for action, cites the rising tensions as an obstacle to Canada doing anything to promote dialogue. Okay, so the NPT is my focus. Widely believed among the arms control community, and certainly those that focus in particular on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is that the 2020 NPT Review Conference is heading for a debacle. The treaty that has, this is serious business when we're talking about the treaty that has been at the heart of global non-proliferation and disarmament efforts for almost 50 years. That treaty, just useful to briefly, the bargain, remind ourselves of the bargain, because of course there are those that would like to forget part of this tripartite bargain underlying the treaty. The non-nuclear weapon states pledge not to acquire nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapon states pledge Article 6, good faith negotiations towards nuclear disarmament, and the non-nuclear weapon states also are to have access to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. The treaty opened for signature in 1968 and entered into force in 1970. Every 5 years, there is a treaty review conference. If one looks back over to sort of assess the status of the treaty, and also, of course, the satisfaction or not of the states parties with that treaty. It's interesting to note that 1975, and the way the parties signal their views about the treaty is that the aim of the conference is a consensus final document. So a statement that all parties, both the non-nuclear weapon states and the nuclear weapon states, can agree to at the end of the conference. And what's been in the 1975 review conference, the first one, agreed a consensus final document. And the 1981 did not, setting up an alternating pattern of success and failure until the landmark 1995 review and extension conference, which Paul Meyer referred to, which was sort of the high point, where the treaty was indefinitely extended and where there were concrete obligations of the nuclear weapon states towards nuclear disarmament and significant progress made, such that the 2000 review conference also had achieved consensus. But the 2005 did not, and the 2015 did not. The reason why I'm raising that now in particular is because now, for the very first time in the history of the NPT review process, it is exceedingly likely that the failure in 2015 will be followed by another failure in 2020. And of course, in every case where there wasn't a consensus document, the heart of the problem was the lack of progress on nuclear disarmament. So when the non-nuclear weapon states felt there was significant, sufficient progress, then there was a consensus document, and where they felt there wasn't, then there wasn't one. And of course, we've already heard discussion about, about the dissatisfaction, about the very topic of this conference, nuclear arms racing. We're not talking about nuclear weapon states party to the NPT making progress towards their nuclear disarmament. We're in we're on a very fast treadmill in the other direction. Now, because this whole focus is supposed to be on Canada's role, like what can we do in this context? Canada's, the importance of Canada's role as a non-nuclear weapon state party to the NPT is precisely because of this kind of strange place we occupy with other non-nuclear weapon states who are also members of NATO. That problematic role and addressing it is central to the role that Canada could play to avoid an NPT 2020 review conference debacle. So I want to turn, if you'll bear with me, I want to turn to comments. I mean, it's interesting because Ernie started off with the Defense Committee, and I'm going to go to the Defense Committee. I'm going to refer to statements that I made there in the context of the study that the Standing Committee on National Defense was doing into the role of Canada and NATO, and they reported the report to Parliament in June of 2018. Now, so I was at some pains in my testimony to talk about the contradiction, if you will, between Canada's role Canada's legal obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and its role as a member of NATO. So I started by saying Canada is a non-nuclear weapon state party to that treaty, as are all the other NATO members, with the exception of the three nuclear powers, USA, UK, and France, who are in NATO. Under Article 6 of the NPT, as interpreted unanimously by the 1996 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, all states parties, whether nuclear weapon states or non-nuclear weapon states, are under a legally binding obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all of its aspects under strict and effective control. That's a quote from the International Court of Justice ruling. So it's not just the nuclear weapon states, it's all states parties that have this obligation. And this is a legally binding obligation under a treaty with 191 members. This legally binding obligation stands in sharp contrast to the strictly political commitment made by NATO member states to its nuclear posture. NATO's nuclear posture is a policy, not a legal obligation. There is no reference whatsoever to nuclear weapons in the North Atlantic Treaty, and that is why you find in many cases in the past, countries like Norway, for example, who won't allow any stationing or entering into the ports of nuclear weapons, they have a footnote to the various declarations. Good Lord, 5 minutes? I've spoken for 10 minutes? I've lost all track of time. Okay, so we've really got to move. Okay, well, I really have... Is this something that happens with the passage of time? Solvability? Oh, God. Okay, so essentially, I can't go through in detail, but essentially, the position that Canada has taken in the past I mean, we have tried to square this contradiction between being under a nuclear umbrella and being committed to nuclear disarmament by doing everything we possibly could to advance nuclear disarmament in various fora. And in the context of the NPT, that meant, in the past, there was no such thing as a NATO caucus. We were there as a non-nuclear weapon state party, trying as hard as we could to bridge the gap with the nuclear weapon states. That all changed when the frustration of the international community reached its boiling point and led to a majority of non-nuclear weapon states negotiating a new treaty, the ban treaty, Canada not taking part. Canada, it's not so much, you can say, okay, we had problems with the way the treaty was being negotiated or whatever. The problem was we lined up with the NATO, with the nuclear weapon states in condemning the treaty. On the very day that the treaty opened for signature, NATO issued an extraordinary statement attacking the treaty. So, in other words, instead of playing a bridging role, we were providing cover for the nuclear weapon states in their failure to make any reasonable, realistic progress, and in fact going in the other direction with respect to the arms race. And we've all heard about new roles for nuclear weapons and so on. Okay, so the point I'm raising here with this, so I made that submission and argued, and I ended my statement with saying that Canada, where does this leave Canada? The answer is clear. It's our legal obligation under Article 6 to begin the process of signing and ratifying the nuclear ban treaty, because in effect that treaty is the fulfillment of Article 6. And in order to do that, we need to begin a dialogue within NATO with the aim of convincing other nuclear weapon states to renounce NATO's unnecessary and dangerously provocative nuclear posture. Okay, so that's what I said. The really surprising thing is that when they issued their report, a unanimous report, that means the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the NDP all agreed to this report, it included a recommendation, a unanimous recommendation to the Government of Canada to take a leadership role within NATO in beginning the work necessary for achieving the stated NATO goal of creating the conditions for a world free of nuclear weapons, and that this work be undertaken on an urgent basis. So an extraordinarily constructive and timely recommendation, unanimous, by the National Defence Committee for Canada to do this. Okay, what's the government's response? The government's response, extraordinary, here is the Foreign Minister's response, if I can find it here, that the Government of Canada agrees with this recommendation. Wonderful, agrees with it. Okay, the government then goes on, okay, so it begins its response, which was required by, they had to respond to Parliament. They begin with the words, the Government of Canada agrees with the recommendation, but then their response offers no new actions within NATO or elsewhere on any basis, let alone an urgent one. Instead, it's a reiteration of current Canadian actions in the Conference on Disarmament and at the UN General Assembly. So, they say they agree with it. It calls for a dialogue in NATO on an urgent basis. The government, in this extraordinary, disingenuous statement, we agree with it. But then there's just a litany of the status quo and, nothing new and nothing urgent and nothing in NATO. So, where that leaves me now with respect to what Canada should be doing, I mean, were Canada to actually take this recommendation seriously in the lead up to the 2020 NPT Review Conference and institute a dialogue within NATO, that would be with a view to setting the stage for ultimately being able to join the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, properly called the ban treaty. That would be an extraordinary signal that Canada was back and interested in playing a really constructive role, bridging the gap between the non-nuclear weapon states and the nuclear weapon states party to the NPT. Thank you very much.
Okay, 15 minutes. As usual, I agree with a lot of the points that Peggy has made. It does remind me of 1985 when Doug Roach was our head of Dell for the review conference, and I was one of the, I was carrying some of the notes and what have you. What struck me was the fact that Russia at the time, the Soviet Union, and the United States both had mutual interest to make sure that the NPT was expanded, and it was really interesting to see the Russian and the American Lou Dunn really talk through things, and of course with the support of many of us, like Australia, Canada, etc. What I have found, though, especially during my 4 years in Geneva, was the fact that Canada overall has retreated from the activist kind of role that we had played in the past, and certainly have been nostalgic for, if you like, and you know, you have wonderful statements about how urgent it is to get back, but it's not happening. And my call it theory is that whether it's a conservative government or liberal, the highest priority is our relationship with the United States. And unfortunately, this gets us into many, I think, difficulties depending on what kind of leadership that we have in the United States. And so what I have seen is Canada kind of retreating from the field, and others, other middle powers, like Norway, like Australia, Japan, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Indonesia, Mexico, Philippines, all kind of getting into that vacuum. And yeah, there's a bunch of acronyms, whether we're talking about NPDI or MITCA or CANS, lots of stuff happening. But for Canada, we went from a Harperite regime that was not really into multilateralism all that much, and to a Trudeau regime that allowed a lot of what I consider policy drift happening in the context of foreign policy and, quite frankly, defense policy too. So we're still at that stage, and I'm not particularly optimistic in terms of post-election and any real dynamism. Anyway, NPT, under siege. India, Pakistan, and Israel, outliers, still out there, and actually kind of laughing at those of us who take nuclear non-proliferation seriously. Because again, we've they're there, and they are witness to the fact that the NPT continues to be under siege. And now we have my good friends, my comrades in North Korea, who are now a nuclear weapon state, thanks to Pakistan, AQ Khan to start, but also on the missile side, thanks to Russia and China. Because we're talking missile technology, we're talking those wonderful parades in Pyongyang that have Chinese missile transporters and launchers. And Chinese have said, oh no, well, yeah, we screwed that up a bit, and this was supposed to be a firefighting thing with those missiles on top. Should back up a little bit in terms of context too. We've talked about strategic stability in the first panel. What I would argue about is the fact that we have a new great game that is being played out by an ascendant China with global ambitions, aided and abetted by junior partner Russia, and we are now looking at an American strategic retreat from its obligations like it had before, which we probably supported. And this retreat is certainly aided and abetted by Trump. And I just don't know how things are going to proceed from there. United Kingdom and France, they love their nukes because that gives them a permanent seat at the Security Council. And of course, it would not be unchallenged. Russia, of course, used to support the US when it was in Russia's interest. And that helped in terms of the removal of nuclear weapons from the Ukraine, from Kazakhstan, all of that. But again, things get a little bit wonky in the geopolitical world when it's in Russia's and China's interest now to keep the United States geopolitically kind of off balance, and it's happening. And China, perhaps others had different perspectives in terms of China's role within the NPT. But I always found that China just was hiding in the weeds because it didn't have to do anything. The United States was charging forward, and that was it. And China could just sort of sit back and watch it. Review conferences, 2010, when I was head of Dell, we did come up with a serious roadmap, but it didn't go any further. And of course, 2015, you have this strange thing where United States and United Kingdom and Canada breaking consensus. And quite frankly, it was over the Middle East issues that we had debated already in 2010, and it goes back to 1995 and earlier. So I'm really not optimistic in terms of what will happen come 2020, but we all have to continue to fight the good fight, and a lot of it is talking to those who continue, middle powers who are continue to be committed to the NPT. A couple of other issues out there that are I think, quite difficult to tackle. One is the nuclear suppliers group. The United States bamboozled the nuclear suppliers group to admit India to be a member. And I think there were sort of visions of lots of money for U.S. nuclear companies, etc. But now, of course, China continues to push its friend, Pakistan, to join. And you're kind of, we, middle powers who are responsible members of the nuclear suppliers group, are being pushed by the United States, by China, to allow more foxes into the nuclear suppliers group henhouse. And I'm not sure where that is going to end up. Nuclear technology control regime. Iran is doing very well, thank you, for the technology that has received from North Korea. And that continues, and as I mentioned, it was Chinese vehicles, launchers that are the backbone of the nuclear, the mobile nuclear force that North Korea has, and Trump's okay with it. You've got a situation where North Korea is firing off nuclear missiles. All against UN Security Council resolutions, but Trump's okay with it because he's blissfully, perhaps, unaware of anything but his beautiful friendship with Kim Jong-un. But China, or not China, but Japan and South Korea, should be worried about the fact that they are within North Korean missile range, never mind the intercontinental stuff. Tactical nuclear weapons have been mentioned before in the previous panel. Now people are talking, some militaries are talking about low-yield nuclear missiles. And my question would be, why? What would you do with them? The conventional weapons are so accurate, so lethal already, so you don't need tactical nuclear weapons, quite frankly. But again, you have this situation where somebody, when we talk about an arms race, somebody's thinking about it, and suddenly other militaries are thinking about it without actually kind of understanding or coming up with the rationale of why they would have actually had to have these low-yield nuclear weapons. And of course, any use of a tactical weapon nuclear weapon has such global implications in terms of the whole nuclear regime and warfighting and all of that. So I'll stop there. In terms of some of the issues that kind of are spinning around in my head on the nuclear side, nuclear non-proliferation side, that quite frankly it's going to take some time to figure out, and probably we will need other political thinkers and leaders to make it happen. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much once again for being here and for showing interest in this topic. We have two distinguished scholars here, Professor Peter Jones and Dr. Ramana. The topic that they are going to discuss is South Asia, the most dangerous case. So, I don't want to waste the time, and then Professor Jones, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I apologize in advance. I have a slight cold, but I'll try and get through this. In thinking of a way to sort of characterize this panel in a brief snapshot, I would say that if you weren't already worried and concerned by the things we've talked about this morning, this panel should drive you over the edge. This is a very dangerous part of the world in many, many ways, and particularly in the ways that we're talking about at this conference. I personally think it's probably the most dangerous part of the world, for reasons I'll go into. I come at this as a practitioner of sort of track 2, track 1.5 dialogues around the world. I've been doing it for many years, and one of those is a dialogue between India and Pakistan. And one of the subsets of that, we have different tracks, but one of the subsets is a dialogue on nuclear issues, which has been going on for over a decade. The participants are former heads of the strategic forces, former chiefs of defense staff, former foreign secretaries, people like that. And it has links into government because of that. And so I'm going to give you some thoughts, my own thoughts, based upon that dialogue. The dialogue itself, of course, goes under the Chatterbox rule, but I'll give you my own sort of views. The first thing I'd say is that when you try to talk about arms control in this region, what you quickly run into is a problem of a sort of a triangular problem, which is to say India regards, or says it regards China as its most significant threat, and therefore must maintain and develop an arsenal to counter China. And Pakistan is a threat, but a secondary one for the Pakistan. So that means that India must have an arsenal of a certain size and capability, and it has to grow, and so on. Excuse me, the Pakistanis say, well, because India's arsenal is so large, we must have one that is disproportionately large, and on you go. And the Indians then say, well, we don't regard Pakistan's arsenal as necessarily being independent. We think it's an adjunct of the Chinese arsenal. And if we have to go to war with China, we have to worry about Pakistan attacking us, and so on. So you get into this situation that makes any kind of discussion of numbers relatively impossible quite quickly. So then you start talking about strategic stability, particularly between the two countries, India and Pakistan. And the first thing you find is that there's no ongoing official discussion of nuclear issues, and hasn't been for many, many years. There was something called the Composite Dialogue some years ago, which was part of the India-Pakistan peace process. That had a strategic dimension, but that's been cancelled for many years. And even while it was happening, it wasn't particularly in-depth. And some of the people in our Ottawa dialogue used to be part of that, and they say, we go much further in the Ottawa dialogue than we used to there. So overall, the habit of dialogue is deeply flawed in this region. And that is particularly so in crisis situations. I mean, those of us who grew up in the East-West context, when you have a crisis, that's when you most need to talk. But in this part of the world, it seems to be the case that when there's a crisis, when something happens, that's when we stop talking, because we want to send a message that we really disapprove of what happened, and therefore we're going to stop talking, which is sort of exactly the opposite of what one would expect, but that seems to be the way things happen. What one finds also is the two sides say, look, we know each other, right? We eat the same food, we watch the same movies, we know each other. And in fact, that's simply not true. The years and years and years of separation have led to a situation where they, in fact, harbor real misunderstandings of one another. And I'm constantly amazed at, when we have these dialogues, when we induct someone new, as we do from time to time, they will have risen to the very top of their nation's military, and they'll walk into them and say, this is the first time I've ever met a Pakistani or an Indian general in my life. And as we get into the discussions of crises that have happened, it becomes clear that they thought they understood the other side's actions, but in fact they didn't. I mean, a few times now after a crisis, a year later, we deconstructed it. And sometimes some of the people on the table have been people who were in command during that crisis. And they've since retired and joined our dialogue, and they will say, on day 3 at such and such a time, we did this to send so-and-so a signal, and we're confident the other side got it. And they go, no, we misinterpreted that. We didn't understand what you were doing. It caused us great concern. So there's a real lack of communication and a real lack of understanding. India has a policy of no first use. It's being increasingly qualified as the years go by. It's not believed by Pakistan. It's never been believed by Pakistan. But what the Pakistanis do believe is that India's policy known as Cold Start is very real. And Cold Start is an Indian doctrine. It's not quite a doctrine. They haven't really formalized it as such, but what they say is that after a particularly spectacular attack some years ago against the Indian parliament, the Indians began to mobilize their army to send a message to the Pakistanis. And they found it took over a month. By the time they mobilized it and got it to the front, the crisis was over. So they embarked upon a policy of saying, we're going to have the ability to stage a significant conventional attack against Pakistan within a few days, from a cold start. And they said, we're going to buy the equipment, we're going to construct the bases. Now, there's some dispute as to whether India has ever really done this. Some say they have, some say they haven't. They've put in place some elements of it. But the Pakistanis are convinced that this is a real threat. And so Pakistan has responded, among other things, with the development of tactical or theater nuclear weapons, whatever you should call them, which they've sort of positioned, or say in the crisis, they were positioned close to the front. And the Pakistanis say, look, this is exactly what NATO did during the Cold War. You were faced with this conventionally superior Soviet threat, which said it could attack you as a surprise. You, NATO, placed tactical nuclear weapons in the field as a way of deterring that threat. We're just doing the same thing. And the Indians, of course, will say, well, no, it's not exactly the same thing. I mean, for all their problems, NATO and the Warsaw Pact did not have a territorial dispute. One side was not arming terrorists to slip across the border and blow things up. This is not the same. So that debate goes on. But it does lead to a very serious problem of these tactical nuclear weapons, which have begun to appear in the scene. And so, for various reasons, some doctrinal, some technological, the region's traditional sort of safeguards are weakening. And these safeguards were that both countries kept their weapons de-alerted and demated. The warheads and the missiles were separate. And so, in a crisis, it took time. But that's now weakening for a couple of reasons. First of all, as I said, these tactical nuclear weapons, once you deploy them, they can't be demated. They have to be ready to go very quickly. And not only that, but logically speaking, the Pakistanis say this is not going to happen. We will retain command and control of the central authority. But logically speaking, as the crisis intensifies, you sort of have to devolve launch authority down the chain to some extent. And the Indians believe that will happen in a crisis. The Pakistanis say no. Another thing that's eroding this traditional sort of de-alerting, demating is that nuclear weapons are now going to sea. in the region. And you can't send a nuclear weapon on a submarine with its warhead in a separate part of the submarine. It doesn't work. They are mated. And so there's some concerns about how they would be launched. There's also a concern in that the Pakistanis are following the Indians to sea, but they don't have nuclear-powered submarines. So they're going to be putting their nuclear weapons on conventionally powered submarines, which means these submarines have to surface every few days and recharge their batteries, which makes them vulnerable. And I mean, during the Cold War, we always imagined that nuclear weapons at sea were stabilizing because they were invulnerable to a first attack and they were second strike weapons, and that evolved as the technology evolved. They became first strike, but nevertheless, we said that that was the most invulnerable part of the deterrent and therefore stabilizing. But the Pakistanis are presenting us with a problem here in that, if a part of their arsenal is on a platform which can be attacked, this creates the sort of use it or lose it pressure. And so the Pakistanis respond by saying, well, then you better not attack any of our conventional submarines in a war, had you? You don't know which one the nuclear weapons are on. And the Indians say, no, we're going to attack. If we find one, we're going to attack it. It's up to you to not have these weapons there. So these sorts of problems. And I characterize it as saying that, ambiguity on both sides is seen as a benefit. But they don't really talk about it. Ambiguity is one thing, but you have to sort of let the other side know certain things, or the ambiguity becomes dangerous. And that's not happening in South Asia. Another point that I would make is that it's difficult for me to tell how much of this is sort of strategic need and how much of it is a kind of a technological, scientific imperative on both sides. Both sides have a very strong, or have developed a very strong sort of nuclear scientific industrial complex, which I think is driving things. And if we can build it, we should. And there's not much of a discussion about, well, how much is enough? What do we really need to accomplish a deterrent mission that's going on? We have that in the Ottawa dialogue. It's not going on officially, and there's not much evidence that the officials are yet interested in having that dialogue. So in the dialogue, we are therefore focused on crisis stability. We spend a lot of time talking about confidence-building measures, about communications channels in a time of crisis. One of the activities we're engaged in is developing a nuclear lexicon between the two sides, because one of the things they found over the years of the discussions is that they use certain terms and they assume the other side knows what they mean, but they don't. In fact, sometimes they use the same terms but mean different things by it. So at our meeting, we have 3 meetings a year, and that we usually spend some time taking a term or two and sort of, what do you mean by that? And so at least when they go home, they'll understand, if they hear this term in a crisis, what the other side means by it. We spend time doing that. Looking ahead, I think the danger which is increasing in the region is not sort of a sudden war or what I would call an intended slide into a nuclear war. I don't think that's going to happen. But it's the broader problem of what I call sort of the deepening sort of commitment traps, which are emerging from the recent crisis. And what I mean by this is that the Indian government has said enough. We're not going to tolerate these large-scale terrorist attacks on our territory. We're going to strike back. We're going to strike back into Pakistan. And this has happened a few times now with Indian forces striking into Pakistan. And the Pakistanis have sort of turned a blind eye. In the last one, there was an altercation between jet fighters. It's been contained in a way. But the problem is that now there's a pressure in India that if there's another spectacular terrorist attack and India does not strike back conventionally into Pakistan, perhaps at a higher level than it has done to now, then the government is seen as weak. And so this trap has been created where you have to respond. And what do you do? And so, and as other policies, notably the Modi government's recent policies on Kashmir, there are going to be future crises. So how do we deal with that? And so we're looking in the Ottawa dialogue at our last meeting, we have one coming up in December, at sort of how to address escalation risks in this kind of an environment. In an environment where you're going to have regular crises, where there's probably going to be a conventional military dimension to them, where both sides suspect the other of being ready to begin a major war, possibly a nuclear one, quite quickly. How do you deal with that? And the problem that we're finding, at our last meeting discussed in great length, is that at the beginning of a crisis, countries take certain steps to sort of secure their nuclear arsenal. They disperse things, they do things like that. But if the other side picks that up in this kind of an environment, maybe it thinks it's a prelude to an attack. And so how do you deal with that? And so we're looking at sort of concepts around things that countries do in a crisis to assure what we call the prudent management of their nuclear arsenal, versus things that are being done to begin to introduce nuclear weapons into the conflict. And can we distinguish between the two, and can we develop a series of understandings which, if one side looks across and sees something going on and says, no, this is just prudent management. But on the other hand, they say, no, this is introduction. We're beginning to get to the point where we feel this is, and so we're beginning to think through those sorts of things. And I'll just conclude by saying, I mean, it's all very interesting work, and it keeps me on airplanes, and it's very interesting to do, but one of the problems and concerns that we have in the Ottawa Dialogue as we do this kind of work is that, you know, we wonder if we're not just making the world safe for low-level conventional warfare between India and Pakistan, because by removing the threat that this could, or by helping to some extent ameliorate the threat that this could escalate inadvertently, we're creating a space for them to have these conflicts. And, you know, that's not what we set out to do. But on the other hand, the alternative isn't a whole lot better. So we sort of continue to do this work, but with a growing sense of unease. And there doesn't seem to be much evidence in terms of the broader India-Pakistan relationship of a willingness on either side to try and resolve some of these issues. In fact, it seems to be going the other way. They have come close. They did come close several years ago to coming up with some kind of a solution to the Kashmir issue. But that seems like a long way away now, and it's going in the opposite direction. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jones. I would like to add something, might not be totally relevant to your topic, but another danger with regards to Pakistan's nuclear arsenal is that they constantly move the nuclear warheads and tactical nuclear weapons by unprotected vehicles. Surprisingly, they sometimes move tactical nuclear weapons with unprotected vans. So this is a big threat that these tactical nuclear weapons might eventually end up at the hands of terror groups like Taliban. So this is another perhaps danger to Pakistan's nuclear arsenal that I think the international community should care for this issue. So now, Dr. Ramana, the floor is yours. Please, you're welcome.
Peter's given a very good sort of overview of the situation. I don't have a whole lot to add, but I do have some pictures. The physicist Werner Heisenberg is supposed to have said some things are so serious you can only joke about them. Like that, I can only show pictures. I don't know if it's true or not, it's apocryphal, maybe. Anyway, so I want to start by sort of highlighting in my very first picture one very distinctive aspect. There's a lot about South Asia that's reminiscent of the Cold War and the US-Soviet Union conflict, you know, the parallels with the NATO documents, and I'll talk about a little bit of that. But one very important difference is exactly what the picture that you see. The picture that you see is from space. It's of the, can you see up there? It's of the Indo-Pakistan border. And it's so brightly lit that the border can be seen from space. Why is this important? Because what it says is that India and Pakistan are geographically next to each other, something which we all know about.
The slides aren't advancing.
They're not meant to advance. Oh. I'm still showing the first picture. The picture in the background. Okay. Yeah, so that's the picture of the kind of model that the US and the Soviet Union had with dealing with their nuclear weapons, which was to use a triad, right? So, so I'll start with India very briefly. So India is partly because I'm from India, but also partly because I think India has been the main driver of the arms race in South Asia. The typical pattern that you can see is that India tries to move forward on one dimension, and then Pakistan tries to catch up with that. And that gap between the two has been sort of increasing over time, and that's one of the, I think, worrisome aspects of the arms race there. So India has based its, what it calls its nuclear deterrent. I don't like the term deterrent because deterrent sort of suggests that there's something inherent about a nuclear weapon that deters, whereas deterrence is very much a psychological reaction. So it depends on whether the person on the other side is deterred or not. So I don't like to use that term, but nevertheless, it's the term that they use, right? And so it bases its deterrent on 3 different wings. So there's a set of bombers that it is adapted to deliver nuclear weapons that are imported from other countries. The primary arm of their nuclear delivery vehicles are land-based missiles. There's a series of short-range missiles called the Prithvi and longer-range missiles called the Agni. These have been sort of developed over the years. The development started in the 1980s, but it's really after 1990 that you see a series of sort of different kinds of Prithvi and Agni missiles being tested, and they are typically of longer range, greater capabilities, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, India has also sort of taken the first plunge into the sea-based nuclear weapons capability through developing nuclear-powered submarines. One called the Arihant has already been deployed, and there are a whole bunch of them sort of being developed at this point. And then India also has a bunch of submarine-launched ballistic missiles to go with these, some of shorter range and some of slightly longer range. And they are at this point, if you're sort of thinking about them as just based on the range, they're typically aimed at either Pakistan or China. I'll come back to that issue towards the very end. India also has plans to deploy a ballistic missile defense force, which is extremely destabilizing. Again, I don't like this term destabilizing, partly because I don't think there is anything called strategic stability in the nuclear arms race. It's just the instability is kind of inbuilt into this whole dynamic that you can see from the history, but nevertheless I'm using terms which are commonly used, and this is something which the Pakistanis are very concerned about. Pakistan's main delivery forces, again, it's a series of nuclear capable missiles, and these are a great range of ranges aimed at sort of tactical nuclear weapons all the way to things which can strike fairly deep into Indian territory. Their target is a naval base that India has in the Bay of Bengal, in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And if you look at the longest range missile, the Shaheen 3, that sort of it can potentially reach that target. The main sort of destabilizer from the Pakistani side, apart from the tactical nuclear weapons that have been talked about, is its claim that they have tested MIRV vehicles, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. It's not been sort of independently verified whether this is true, but this definitely claim that Pakistan has made. Pakistan has also been trying to put nuclear weapons into sea using either ships or diesel-powered submarines. They have an interest in developing a nuclear-powered submarine, but it's not. It's fairly early stages at this point. And of course, like India, it also has bombers which they've imported from other countries that they have adapted to be able to deliver nuclear weapons. Just a couple of words about sort of contemplating the use of nuclear weapons. I don't believe any country develops nuclear weapons without thinking about how to use them. That's part and parcel of what happens. So in the Indian case, the primary document that actually determines how this is going to be used is something called the Draft Nuclear Doctrine that was enunciated in 1999. It has no official status, but if you look at everything that has happened since, it goes sort of along the script that was laid out in that. And one of the elements of that is something that Peter alluded to, the so-called no first use doctrine, which is saying that India will not be the first to initiate a nuclear strike, but will, what they call, respond with punitive retaliation should deterrence fail. In other words, they will kill large numbers of people. That's basically what their thing is. But this is a doctrine which they have talked about a lot. I think it gives them a lot of diplomatic brownie points in various conferences. But in reality, if you look at every statement or many statements that Indian leaders have made, it's very clear that they don't really plan to follow that. Because what they really say is, the moment we think that, it's usually against Pakistan that this comes up because it's the context of various military crises that I'll talk about, it's usually the statement they would make is the moment we think Pakistan is on the verge of a nuclear attack or is starting a nuclear attack, we will use these things first, right? So it's what might be called a launch on warning posture, but the question to be asked is how reliable is the warning when you have such a short range, right? So if you want to be seen as acting in advance of the attack, then you have to start your preparations really fast. And simultaneously, there's also been the move towards developing missiles that do not have to be fueled and loaded with warheads just before launch, but are ready to be taken off, what are called canisterized configurations. And this has been sort of a technological driver for this posture. Pakistan, we've sort of also talked about a lot of their efforts, but I think a lot of what Pakistan has been doing has been, can be understood from their idea of what they call full spectrum deterrence, that they want to be able to counter a whole range of military initiatives that India can take, and this requires them to be able to have nuclear weapons on a vast range of delivery vehicles, including tactical nuclear weapons. Okay, the bulk of the few minutes I want to say is that I think a lot of these drivers, to understand them really, you have to see the kinds of conflicts that India and Pakistan have had. They have a long history, but I'm specifically going to talk about the period after the nuclear weapons test. Unlike what was claimed by advocates for nuclear weapons in both India and Pakistan, the coming of nuclear weapons into the subcontinent has not meant greater peace or a lack of war, but instead you've seen periodic crises, including in 1999, 1 year after the nuclear test, when India and Pakistan actually went to war. It killed about 1,000 people, so by any reasonable definition of the word war, it should be considered a war. And in a sense, one can argue, and I'm not going to talk about it right now, but there's a good reason to think that this was a war that was actually caused by nuclear weapons, rather than the other way around, right? And this has to do with the earlier history under Benazir Bhutto and so on. If anybody's interested, I can talk about it offline. But this particular war between the two states featured about a dozen plus threats by high-level nuclear officials. Which is very important. There were reports, not necessarily very credible, but still reports in the public media that nuclear weapons were prepared for use on both sides. And then subsequently, there was another crisis that Peter mentioned in 2001, 2002, which started with an attack on the Indian Parliament in December of 2001. What is interesting about that particular crisis was that there was a military confrontation between them. Hundreds of thousands of troops were deployed. At the end of the crisis, both India and Pakistan claimed victory, right? That's a very important thing, right? And so for the Indian side, their claim was that coercive diplomacy worked, that we bought all our tanks on the border and Musharraf caved in and he said, I'm going to control my terrorists, all right? And on the Pakistani side, there was an argument that was very simple. They said, India bought all these troops, but they didn't attack us. That's because we have nuclear weapons, all right? And so we won this particular confrontation, right? And this has been a huge problem, because then you see this kind of repeating dynamic. The most recent of which was in February of this year, when a suicide attack in Kashmir killed over 40 Indian paramilitary troops, and a particular militant group in Pakistan called Jaish-e-Mohammed claimed the responsibility. The Pakistani foreign minister said, this is not our doing, this is somebody else. And it's a question how much control the Pakistan government has over these kinds of groups. But I leave that aside. But the problem was this particular attack went worse, and this has partly to do with the kind of lessons that both India and Pakistan have learned from these earlier crises, including the one that Peter mentioned, which is cold start, right? So the Indians said, okay, this time we're not going to leave you alone, we're going to actually attack, and they attacked across the border, right? For the first time, we had airplanes flying across the border on both sides, and one particular, India sort of carried out an attack on the Pakistani side, which it claimed was attacking a terrorist training camp, and then there was a sort of pilot that was captured from the Indian side on the other side, and so on and so forth. You all probably saw the news, I'm not going to talk about that. But what is, I think, important was that during the height of the crisis, apparently the Indian Navy sent out 2 nuclear-armed submarines into the area. and they were on exercise earlier, and once the crisis started, they were redeployed to that area. And Pakistan, in turn, sort of said that they had seen an Indian submarine trying to enter Pakistani waters, and they had foiled that attempt, right? So they came pretty close to conflict on the sea as well, right? The last thing which I want to say, there's one new player that you saw in this particular conflict, which was not there earlier, which is the role of social media. And social media was really goading leaders on both sides to actually do something about it. And I can talk about this at some more length, but I just want to mention, flag this important thing, because it's not something which we often sort of think about. We think about nuclear weapons, we think about planes, missiles, but this is also a very important player as we see going forward. I'll just kind of finish by saying that to kind of address the point that Peter mentioned, we all know about this triangle between India, Pakistan, and China, but I think it's a four-way race. And the fourth player in this race is the United States. Right? And ever since the whole end of the Cold War, and India and the United States have been coming closer, and this is kind of cemented through the US-India nuclear deal that I think Maria sort of talked about earlier. And the part of the whole motivation for that was the United States' attempt to try and shore up India as a potential rival to China and bring it on its side. Right? And this, I think, has grave repercussions. I don't think I have time to talk about it, but I think this is something to watch. Thank you.
The prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran unsettled neighboring countries and threatened arms race in the Middle East. And to thwart Iran's nuclear ambitions, the international community imposed untold amount of crippling economic sanctions on Iran, and Iran responded by entering negotiations in 2013, which eventually resulted in a nuclear agreement known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, also known as Iran's nuclear agreement. Well, Iran agreed to roll back in its nuclear program in exchange for sanction relief, and the other parties of the JCPOA expressed optimism that the deal would prevent proliferation in the Middle East. But the problem was that Iran has a long history of fomenting tension in the region and an equally long record of deception in dealing with the safeguard division of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. So as a result, a strong residue of mistrust clouded the JCPOA achievement. And so now what I'm trying to discuss is the response of three major Middle Eastern countries to the JCPOA and the outcome of their policy towards Iran and the nuclear agreement. I would start with Israel and then Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So Israel, as we know, the only country in the Middle East with nuclear weapons, has emerged as the leading opponent of Iran's nuclear agreement. Following just to go back to the history of Israel dealing with Iran nuclear program, following the discovery of Iran's nuclear program in 1990s, Israel has launched a fierce and multifaceted campaign to roll it back. The Israeli intelligence services, sometimes alone, sometimes with the US intel services, with the CIA, tried hard to expose and damage Iran's nuclear infrastructure by clandestine tools. And on the diplomatic front, Israel tried hard to impose harsh economic sanctions on Iran. But by 2009, the newly elected government of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Likud government, concluded that despite some guarded success, these measures would fail to stop Iran's nuclear progress. So Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, and his defense minister, Ehud Barak, tried to execute a preemptive strike. Between 2010 and 12, Netanyahu and Barak tried to persuade the security cabinet to attack, but they failed because of the strong objection from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and the intelligence chiefs, and several cabinet ministers. They argued that the action was ill-conceived because Iran was still several years away from weaponization, and most importantly, the action would present a vastly complex military challenge. and cannot be carried out without the help of the United States. So Netanyahu was forced to revert to the diplomatic road and urged the United States to negotiate a zero enrichment deal, which the Obama administration viewed as unrealistic because the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty entitled the members to a civilian nuclear program. Well, if the truth be told, honestly, the JCPOA presented Iran with a severe setback, but Netanyahu mobilized the Israel lobby in Washington to defeat it in Congress. But despite Netanyahu's opposition, the Likud government's opposition, there were a number of high-profile organizations in Israel that blessed the deal. For instance, the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission passed a resolution following the JCPOA, passed a resolution praising the deal. This stand was really remarkable because this highly secretive organization played a key role in evaluating the nuclear information gathered by the intelligence services. Also, the head of the IDF, General Gadi Eisenkot, said the deal harbors both risks and opportunities, but the Prime Minister's office only emphasizes on the risks. But what helped Netanyahu was the testing of the ballistic missiles by Iran's Revolutionary Guards, which provoked strong negative reactions. Especially the Iranians painted on the missiles that Israel should be wiped off the map. The Likud government claimed that the Iranian hardliners still did not abandon the dream of destroying the Jewish state. The Obama administration responded by sanctioning entities and individuals linked to the Iran's ballistic missile program, but that gesture but that was considered as a inadequate gesture by the U.S. Congress. So. And also the election of Donald Trump added to the uncertainty about the future of the JCPOA. And as we know, on May 8, 2018, Trump abrogated the American participation of the ACER. Well, even before this formal abrogation, the American aggressive policy made it really hard for President Rouhani to protect all the aspects of the JCPOA mandated compliance. Israel has used so many strategies to roll back Iran's nuclear program, including the military one, but it did not launch a preemptive attack on the Iranian facilities because of the intense divisions between the military and the civilian leadership. And it also could not secure the American support to execute the attack. But Israel is expected to continue with its effort to undermine Iran's economy through sanctions and subversion. Now let me go to the case of Saudi Arabia. Saudis were actually less vocal than the Israeli government, but the WikiLeaks documents and other sources indicated that they are exceedingly frustrated with the Obama's Iran policy. Actually, the JCPOA was seen by the Saudis as an indication, as an indication that Washington is willing to tolerate Iran's expansionism at the cost of its historical alliance with the Arab states. So, and Saudis, just to make their feeling known, some of the Saudi officials urged the government to match Iran's nuclear advances. And as a matter of fact, they moved in that direction by laying down the King Salman nuclear infrastructure. So the Obama administration tried to dissuade them from the nuclear path by agreeing to upgrade the Patriot anti-ballistic missile defense system operating in the kingdom, but that apparently did not diminish their anger. So, but one thing is clear from my understanding, and that is Saudis have a vested interest in demonstrating that the JCPOA would spur proliferation in the Middle East. They, along with the Israeli intelligence services, found it useful to disclose some information strengthening the nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. Well, the good point is, at the present time, there is nothing in the Salman Doctrine that hints for proliferation. They also have a arsenal of ballistic missiles, but they are conventional. But they are conventional. Sorry, but the missiles are conventional, but they can be modified to carry nuclear warhead if the occasion require it. And another point is that obtaining a nuclear weapon is an extremely difficult and complex process, and it would probably take several years for Saudis to create a nuclear weapon infrastructure. The kingdom is also party to the NPT and has a comprehensive safeguard agreement with the IAEA. The intrusive agreement and verification regime would make it extremely difficult for Saudis to have a clandestine enrichment program. And Saudis would probably also find it difficult to purchase enrichment technology. The nuclear supplier group, the NSG, is not likely to transfer dual-use technologies to a country that intending on having them for the nuclear weapons option. But they probably might go to the black market if the JCPOA collapses. One possible option would be Pakistan, that could supply Saudis with the ready-made nuclear warhead if the JCPOA again collapses. So now I would go to the case of Egypt, since I'm running out of time. The case of Egypt is really interesting. Well, when in December 1961, the Israel nuclear demonocide was revealed, the Egyptians declared that if Israel go to nuclear, we would secure our own nuclear weapon at any cost. But in spite of some occasionally high-profile rhetoric, the Egyptians never launched a sustained nuclear program, military or civilian. Perhaps they understood that the cost of having a nuclear weapon program is too much for political and economic reasons. But instead, Egypt joined NPT in 1980 and pushed for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That decision perhaps colored the response to the JCPOA. Well, yeah, perhaps the cost of weapon program is a major obstacle to the Egypt proliferation. For a country like Egypt with a small GDP, it would be extremely difficult to generate sufficient funds for a weapon program in a short period of time. And yeah, it is also likely that the economic and domestic turmoil would preoccupy Egypt for some time, and compared to having ambition for nuclear weapons, which makes its proliferation risk moderate. I need 1 more minute. And one good option would be probably for the United States to keep nuclear technology away from being established in Egypt. And also I believe the United States should, or the other parties of the NPT should pressure President al-Sisi to ratify the additional protocol. So here is the bottom line. If Iran defaults on the JCPOA, that could radically reconfigure the equation in the region, and perhaps the new arms race in the region would be inevitable. By that I mean race for the nuclear weapons capability. If that is going to happen, Saudi Arabia and Egypt would probably leverage their fledgling nuclear energy to military projects, and Israel may try once again to execute a military strike, or at the very least a massive clandestine operations.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is the beginning of the second half of our conference program today, and I think if it's at least as stimulating and thought-provoking as the first half was, I think we're in for a treat. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce 2 dear friends and colleagues that are, I think, without a doubt, among Canada's foremost experts on the topic at hand, which is the security of outer space. The proper title of the session is Star Wars, Coming to a Space Near You. And I think we're going to assess, I don't want to preempt what they might have to say, but I think we're going to assess the extent to which outer space as a domain is a sanctuary for peaceful purposes, for scientific endeavors, or whether it is in fact another domain for war. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Paul. Jessica? Okay, Jessica. To my left, Dr. Jessica West from Project Clusters to go ahead with her presentation. Jessica, please.
Okay, I'll try to speak closely because I have a small voice. Welcome, thanks for being here. Are there any Star Wars fans in the audience? Ooh, a few. Okay, I'm not one. We're divided in my family. But my opening line used to be when people ask what I did, oh, I do Star Wars, I work on Star Wars. And it was funny because it wasn't really true, because truth was so far from fiction. It's not such a joke anymore as reality is edging closer and closer to fiction. And so the focus of my presentation and my slides today will be to walk you through sort of where we started from in outer space, because this isn't a new topic for arms control, even though we're covering it under a focus of a new domain of warfare, and where we've come from and where we are now and what that looks like. And the short answer is it's not good, and hopefully you'll agree with me when we get to the end. After my talk, then we're going to hand it over to Paul. Paul's going to give us, he's going to dazzle us with his diplomatic skills and understanding of the state of play on governance issues. So yes, my talk will walk us through the reality of where we are in terms of technology in outer space and arms control, but I do want to do a quick plug of the Space Security Index, which is my baby that I birth every year. And it takes a really wide approach and a comprehensive approach to security. I'm going to focus on a very narrow element of that project, which is the military uses of outer space, but I'm going to come back to some of the themes of this broader perspective of security at the end, and link back to why this question about arms control in space matters from a more comprehensive perspective of security. So where did we start from? Arms control isn't really a new topic for outer space, and I love that the title of today's conference is called Speeding Towards the Abyss, because a sense of facing an abyss was very much a reality in the early space age. And the key instrument that we have to govern outer space and to limit what we do there is the Outer Space Treaty. And this is referred to as a partial non-armament treaty, but the focus was really on preventing outer space from being a domain where nuclear weapons are orbiting, and that was seen as the abyss. And taking a step back from the abyss was the role of the Outer Space Treaty. And for the last 50 years, we've been able to say that space is militarized but not weaponized. So it's been acceptable, it's been considered peaceful uses to have satellites orbiting around the Earth that have military functions but are more or less orbiting around the Earth, basically. That's what they do. And for those of us that work on arms control in outer space, we were one of the privileged few that could say, we're working from a preventive perspective. We're still trying to prevent the weaponization of space. And this dichotomy between peaceful purposes and weapons has really been the ongoing focus of our work, and preventing weaponization has been a key driver of civil society. That's not really where we are anymore. Now, I do want to be clear that dreams of space weapons have loomed large over that time period. And that's why we've been focusing on preventing the weaponization of space, because there have been a lot of crazy, really crazy ideas about dropping bombs from space, dropping big metal rods from space, rods from God they're called, and a lot of other odd ideas, including the original Star Wars concept, space-based missile interceptors. And yet, we haven't gone there in outer space. And why was that? Even though it's seen as the ultimate high ground, this huge military coup that would be possible if only we could do it technologically, there's also been a lot of restraint. There was the ABM treaty, and there was a voluntary moratorium on anti-satellite testing that started in 1984. And really, for a long time, space was seen as too important for warfare. We need restraint because we can't mess it up. It's too important. And I would say that that has changed today. Today we see space as a domain of warfare, and I'm saying we, it's really a handful of countries, but it's countries that include China, Russia, the United States, NATO as a group, India, more and more countries. And this is a significant change from the past. I want to explain what we mean by, what others mean by space as a domain of warfare. So I did have the opportunity a while ago to sit next to one of the key thinkers behind the Space Force in the United States. And the way he explained it is that, space is both vital and vulnerable. So space has become so entwined in the way that we fight wars on Earth. And at the same time, it's incredibly vulnerable. But because it's used to fight wars, if another country were to launch an attack on the United States and they're using a satellite to guide their missile or to provide communications, then it is our duty as the military to stop that attack from happening. And if it's using space capability, then we have to prevent the use of that capability. And so that's how the United States military at least defines what they mean by warfare. We're not talking about orbiting troops in space. We may or may not be talking about orbiting weapons in space, and that's sort of the ambiguity that we're facing at the moment. But there's a lot of evidence recently of this shift in thinking that has taken place from space as peaceful uses, space as a sanctuary, space as too important for warfare, to space as a domain of warfare. And I'll walk you through what that looks like today. Non-kinetic interference with satellites. There already is a lot of conflict in outer space. There is rampant electronic and to some extent cyber warfare that is happening in outer space. So jamming of satellites, spoofing of signals. It's certainly a key feature of conflicts right now in both Ukraine and Syria. We've seen it happen in the Baltics with GPS spoofing. And in this regard, space systems are already a target of conflict, but it's not blowing things up. It's using sort of non-destructive means. But there's other things that are happening as well. Anti-satellite capabilities. I mentioned that earlier with a question. So after the moratorium in 1984, we've actually had quite an uptick in anti-satellite activity in recent years. This mostly started in 2007 when China conducted the first anti-satellite test since 1984-85. And it came as a shock to the world because there had been restraint in place. This was something that I think was not surprising for some, but surprising for many, including myself. And it was quickly followed by another demonstration by the United States. So these are activities where they're not blowing up someone else's satellite. They're not conducting warfare like that, but they're targeting their own satellites to show we have this capability and here's what we can do. And then most recently was the Indian one. And what stands out for me from that, and I think should be of concern to this room, is the sense to which the global response to that anti-satellite test suggested that it's become normalized. There really wasn't a lot of outcry. There's a lot of cheering on the part of the Indians, but not a lot of outcry from the international community about, we need to stop doing activities like this. This is not a legitimate act. So I found that quite concerning. And also the fact that weapons tests are now a signal of space power. And I think that's concerning as well. Other things that I can't go into too much detail because it's hard to explain would be what I call ambiguous activities on orbit. And this comes up in the media now and again. But more or less what I'm talking about are dual-use capabilities to do strange things in outer space that we didn't used to be able to do. So generally we would put a satellite in orbit and it would rotate in orbit around the Earth until it was finished being used and either return to Earth orbit or we'd move it into graveyard orbit. Now we have new technical capabilities that allow satellites to move around in orbit, to approach other satellites, to even manipulate other satellites. These things aren't inherently good or inherently bad. We could use them to repair satellites or we could use them to harm someone else's satellite. They might simply be spying on other satellites. They might be trying to get a sense of what another capability is. They might be collecting electronic intelligence. The tricky thing for militaries is that they don't know what they're doing. So they're not necessarily dangerous, but they're not dangerous. And that puts military is in an odd situation. And it's through these changes in the way that we're using outer space, the growth in electronic interference, the weird things happening on orbit that are difficult to understand what they imply and what they mean, as well as the ongoing anti-satellite testing that is leading many countries to develop dedicated military forces for space. And that is new. That is a change from the past. And I know Space Force stands out, and I write about it, and it's in the media a lot. If you talk about Space Force, it's a good way to get attention. But when I sat down and tried to list all the different countries that are actually moving towards having military units dedicated to space, it's quite a long list, and most of this has happened in the last year. So in addition to the United States, Russia has had aerospace forces since 2015. China has had the Strategic Support Force, which combines space, cyber, and electronic warfare into a single command since 2015. There's the United States. The United Kingdom announced a new military command for space in May. France has announced a new space command that they're creating, and I'm missing India from that list. And I think there are going to be more that come. Japan as well is going to turn their air space defense forces into an air and space defense force. And a lot of countries are thinking about how to defend themselves in space. So active defense and deterrence. There's a new program by the United States and the United Kingdom called Operation Olympic Defender. I don't really know what it does. I think they're probably trying to figure out what it does. But the focus is on strengthening deterrence, deterring hostile actions by rivals. And Canada too is thinking about this. They just had the Shields Up competition, where they're seeking proposals for how Canada can protect satellites in orbit. And so this is a question that I think spans a lot of different countries, not just those that are thinking about weapons. And it's a hard one for us because it blurs this focus on warfare and deterrence and defense. It blurs that traditional divide we had between peaceful uses and weaponizations. And I think it really makes it a much more complex topic from a governance perspective now. And just before ending, I will also say that it's also a lot, so what's happening in outer space is about more than just military competition. Geopolitics and frontier thinking are front and center of how we think about space these days. So we're talking about the abyss, except space now is seen as the next frontier, the final frontier, if you will. So the future focus of state power, of commercial power, of new resources in outer space, and the sense that who gets there first and who gets highest is going to dominate in the future. And that ties into the military competition that we're seeing. And I'll end with a few points about why this matters, because I think sometimes it can be hard to appreciate the dangers that are connected with arms racing and military confrontation in outer space, because it's up there. It feels like it's up there. It doesn't hurt humans, or so it seems. It's technology. It's removed from us. But I think there's a lot of dangers. The first is violating the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty and the focus on peaceful uses. To me, that would be another step towards eroding the global framework of laws and rules and understandings that have governed us for a really long time. So it would sort of be another notch on that stick. Environmental destruction is another one. It's really easy to mess space up, really easy. And it's an environment that we rely on for everyday activities. So messing it up, bad. Safety risks. Space is not just a military domain. I have a colleague who likes to say, space is Main Street. The majority of satellites up there are commercial, and they're not military, and they are put at risk when we treat outer space as a domain of warfare. There's also significant humanitarian impacts. Most satellites do more than one thing. Most satellites support a bunch of, basically our everyday life here. But even if you're thinking about lives saved and lives lost, we rely on satellites for that. We rely on them for responding to disasters, for search and rescue, for humanitarian interventions, as well as other things like transportation and communication. And then there's dangerous escalation risks. And I think it was Dr. Teeple that was talking about how nuclear is becoming entwined in non-nuclear. Space is deeply entwined in almost every other topic we're going to talk about today. We use AI in space. There's space and cyber are entwined. And space and nuclear remain entwined. Command and control of nuclear forces is done through space. And as we start treating those things as legitimate targets, we risk escalating conflicts in really unknown ways. And I've participated in, and I've seen reports of a lot of tabletop exercises that try to predict how space conflicts will escalate. And it's really tricky, and it's always a little bit different. And the real threat, though, is that it leads to something much bigger than just harming a few satellites. So I'll leave it at that, because we have people like Paul who can let us know how we're going to save the world before we ruin it.
Thank you very much for that, Jessica. I mean, lots of useful points and scary indeed. And the very last one I see there is dangerous escalation routes. So that's certainly unsettling. Just very briefly on your point about linkages between space and nuclear. I mean, those of you who have attended conferences of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, may have noticed that it is not uncommon for a country like Russia to bring in space in their official statements at the NPT context. And even though they don't use the word precondition, they do refer to outer space security matters as something to be resolved before we can resolve the nuclear question. With that, I'll pass it to Ambassador Palmeier.
Thank you, Cesar. Thanks. This is. Oh. Let's see if we get. Great. Okay. Thanks, Cesar. Thanks, Jessica, for the scene setting. And indeed, I guess I have déformation professionnelle as a former diplomat to be thinking of prevention, rather than having to mop up the mess after something proverbial hits the fan. When I entitled this panel Star Wars Coming to a Space Near You, obviously there was a little tongue-in-cheek with this. But the media, for instance, has never seemed to be able to have an intelligent discussion on the topic of space security without invoking the moniker of Star Wars from the 1980s. And it does, alas, remind us of the ultimate end of the rhetoric and actions we are now witnessing. For much of the half-century period we refer to as the space age, states have displayed a significant degree of restraint in their activity in outer space, despite an ongoing competition between rival powers. This situation was largely due to one of the great, if now largely unsung, diplomatic accomplishments of the 20th century. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, with its 107 states parties. This treaty set up a unique status for outer space as a global commons, or in the somewhat less PC language of the treaty itself, a province for all mankind, over which no claim of sovereignty or national appropriation would be allowed. And if you're thinking of conflict prevention, just think of how profound that was as a concept. Think of all the conflicts down here on Earth that had at its origin contested claims over territory or national sovereignty. So it's indeed, I think, an indication of an enlightened diplomacy that was present at that time. Furthermore, the treaty specifies that activity in space should be for peaceful purposes and for the benefit and in the interests of all countries. This peaceful orientation was reinforced by the treaty's prohibition on stationing weapons of mass destruction in outer space, but as well as prohibiting any militarization of the moon or celestial bodies. There was a distinct air and indeed a celebration of international cooperation that is evident throughout the treaty, with provisions for observation of space launches, visits to installations in space, as well as reporting to the public and to the international scientific community on the results of space activities. Activities which, again, were to be conducted, quote, for the benefit and in the interests of all countries. The cooperative spirit embodied in the Outer Space Treaty continues in several areas. I think perhaps the best manifestation being the International Space Station. But it must be acknowledged that it is under a major assault in other fields of space activity. The foundational Outer Space Treaty seems to have disappeared from the vocabulary of certain space powers, to be replaced by unilateral assertions that outer space has become a war-fighting domain, one in which the pursuit of military dominance is the key objective. The vast majority of states, however, continue to believe that an arms race in outer space should be prevented. And since the early 1980s, they have voiced that conviction in an annual resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly by a wide margin. In its most recent iteration, Resolution 73/30, for those who are UN resolution wonks, it was supported by 181 yes votes, with only the US and Israel registering a no vote. Now, this resolution supports the legal regime set out in the Outer Space Treaty, but also expresses the need to, quote, to consolidate and reinforce that regime and enhance its effectiveness. It calls for, quote, further measures to prevent an arms race in space, and enjoins states to, quote, refrain from actions contrary to that objective. It specifically suggests that these further measures should include preventing the weaponization of outer space. And I should remind you that the prohibition in the Outer Space Treaty only applies to weapons of mass destruction. The treaty is silent on other types of weapons. Despite this regular expression of the will of the international community, the progress in realizing the calls set out in that resolution has been meager to date. The Conference on Disarmament, the 65-nation forum in Geneva that is supposed to be the UN's venue for the negotiation of multilateral arms control and disarmament agreements, has been moribund for over 20 years. Yes, you heard that correctly, over 20 years. Not even an agreement on a program of work, because it's trapped in a Gordian knot produced by its extreme application of the consensus rule, which allows any state to effectively veto any decision. This situation has been detrimental, evidently, for any official work on the CD's agenda item concerning prevention of an arms race in outer space. The forum has only been able to engage in ad hoc, informal discussions on space, which go nowhere. The CD was also the chosen venue for the one major treaty proposal on space security developed in the last decade. I'm referring to the Sino-Russian draft treaty on the prevention of placement of weapons in outer space and the use of force on outer space objects, better known, fortunately, by its acronym, PPWT. Given the CD's gridlock, no sustained work has been done on this draft, although it has attracted severe criticisms from the US. Looking for more viable avenues for space security diplomacy, states have tried several other options. The European Union initiated in 2008 a promising international code of conduct on outer space activities, but that failed to launch in 2015 after opposition from the BRICS grouping of states that insisted that any such negotiation of a code would have to be held under a UN consensus mandate. More productive was the work of a UN group of governmental experts looking at transparency and confidence building measures for outer space that produced in 2013 a consensus report recommending a menu of such measures. But alas, the geopolitical climate was already starting to deteriorate at that time, and there has been little take-up by states of the GGE's recommendations. A further GGE, this group of governmental experts, to examine possible legal elements of a prevention of arms race agreement was established in the 2018-2019 timeframe, but was unable to release a report due to the last-minute opposition of the representative of one state amongst its 20 members. No prize for guessing what state this was. The Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, an 89-member state forum in Vienna, was this year able to gain agreement for a set of voluntary guidelines regarding the sustainability of space, although this body and the guidelines eschew space security matters. So at a time when arguably developing diplomatic alternatives to a rising chorus preparing for space warfare should be a priority task, the current international scene is devoid of initiative. Canada, which once was a champion of the non-weaponization of space and the originator of several constructive proposals for confidence-building measures in that realm, has been missing in action for over a decade. It's useful to remember there was the time, indeed, the chief reason cited by the government of Canada for declining participation in U.S. national missile defense, not once but twice, under Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and under Prime Minister Paul Martin, was concern over implications for its support for the non-weaponization of outer space. We don't see that sort of profile or advocacy any longer from this government. The EU, problematically having rather fumbled its international code of conduct, shows no sign of wanting to pick up the ball again. Our use of and dependence on space is growing exponentially, and yet we see scant activity to preserve this unique, benign environment from man-made threats. Although I believe it is incumbent on the states that are parties to the Outer Space Treaty to uphold its provisions and defend its goal of international cooperation, not confrontation in outer space, their collective inaction may spur other stakeholders to come forward. As we are witnessing in a parallel round of cybersecurity policy, the private sector and civil society are becoming more active on policy and security issues. They recognize that irresponsible state behavior in outer space could be devastating for their business, not to mention for humanity's well-being. It will require more consistent advocacy, however, on the part of such stakeholders if peaceful access and operations in outer space are to be preserved. Thank you for your attention.
So without further ado, we have Alison Whitlock here from Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and then Wesley Ward from our own university, as well as Emeritus Professor from the University of Toronto. Delighted and grateful to have both of them at the table. Grateful to all of you for staying. I know it's a long day, but they have really, really interesting things to say. So on this note, let me invite you to get us started. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Okay, good. All right, well, yeah, let's talk about cybersecurity, everybody's favorite topic these days. I do feel like it's helpful at the start of a presentation like this to clarify what angle of cybersecurity I will be talking about. It's one of these topics that has multiple points of entry and multiple dimensions. So I'm really going to be focusing my remarks today on the international relations dimension of cybersecurity and talking about how states, how governments, and sometimes their proxies as well, are using it as a medium or also as a tool for war fighting or other forms of antagonism. And my remarks today are going to have two parts. First, we're going to take a look at how cyberspace is becoming militarized and why that is a concern. And secondly, what is the international community doing about this? But because it's the middle of the afternoon, and I'm sure people are tired because this is the time of day we get tired, I thought I might start out with a little bit of audience participation. It's easy, don't worry. The title of this panel is Cyberspace, Sanctuary or a New Domain of Warfighting. So if you feel that cyberspace is a sanctuary, put up your hand.
I'm an idealist.
Okay. No, it's got to be another idealist out there. Tell me, please. All right. And then if you think it's a new domain of warfighting, put up your hand. All right. Okay. What about, do you think it should be a sanctuary? All right. Here are my people. Okay. But no, I think this is a good thing to sort of start with because it is imperative to do what we can to preserve cyberspace as a sanctuary and as a peaceful commons. Why? First, while the internet was developed for military purpose, I think there is no doubt that this is an overwhelmingly civilian domain or medium, however you want to call it. We use digital networks to do everything from order food, to stream entertainment, to find a date, to pay our bills. We all know all the very many things that we do every day that are determined on information and communications technologies, or ICTs. And my point is that this ubiquity makes individuals vulnerable in a very indiscriminate way and makes the potential for damage and harm extremely pervasive in ways that we're not necessarily prepared to respond to because we haven't had to yet. And secondly, it's also important to recognize that ICTs are very central to socioeconomic development. And the more that we militarize the space, the more that technologies can become stigmatized, co-opted, and also potentially controlled or restricted. We need to protect technology for the good that it can bring. And then third, and maybe this is more of a personal view, but why can't we just get it right this time? We've already littered our physical world with so much pain and so much suffering caused by weapons, by armed violence, and by armed conflict. Why can't we just leave cyberspace alone? And for my organization, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, this is really sort of our starting point on this issue. We view the militarization of cyberspace as an expansion of existing patriarchal structures of violence that perpetuate repression. And this is a kind of militarization, especially in cyberspace, that is overlooking the systemic and the root causes of violence and exacerbating them. It's setting out to potentially create violence in a space where it doesn't otherwise automatically occur. So while I wish that I could say cyberspace is a sanctuary, I think we all know that the data and the headlines tell us differently. Precise estimates vary, but it's generally accepted that at least a dozen states, and possibly as many as 30, are developing or have in place offensive cyber capabilities in connection with their military structures or military doctrine. Some, including NATO, which is of course an alliance of many countries, have formally acknowledged cyberspace as an operational domain of warfare. We know that 25 countries are suspected of sponsoring cyber operations, and many others are using proxies, non-state actors, to do their dirty work for them, and making the connection is a little more challenging. So the pivot to militarization is happening. And what do some of these operations tend to look like? It's a big spectrum and a big range of activities. I think that in recent years, and actually in preparing for this, I was looking back at what were some trends within interstate cyber operations. I don't like to use the word attack quite yet, because I feel like that's also further justifying the militarization of cyberspace. But what you saw as trends and activities in 2016 is definitely changing as we roll through 2019 and into the future. There has been an increase in the use of ransomware, and a lot of this is maybe more in the private sector, but it's not impossible to think that this could also be applied increasingly between governments to hold ransom some of our critical infrastructure or vital assets. Software supply chain attacks are on the up and up. We're also seeing, if you've seen the headlines this week, there's more of a recourse to using cyberspace or tools, cyber tools, digital tools, as more of an automatic recourse for responding to aggressive actions and perceived threats. And then sort of separate from this, there's a growing body of evidence about the extent to which states are repressing the human rights of their citizens through malware, most often surveillance software, that's being designed expressly for this purpose. And then on top of this, in case you were still thinking you could sleep tonight, there are also concerns about existing weapon systems and their vulnerability to network attack. I'm talking about drone signaling, nuclear weapon systems. We're going to talk next about autonomous weapons, and there's also a concern there. The dark web is a haven for arms trafficking and trading. And so my point is that on top of the activities that happen in cyberspace uniquely, there are also these touch points with existing weapons and security issues. But before I transition into the sort of like solutions and what we're doing about all of this part of my presentation, I guess maybe 2 takeaways from this problem side would be that first, and as of yet, the majority of cyber operations still tend to be geared more toward disruption or causing discord than about like a very high level, severe, or overt armed attack. And this is important because it's becoming a complicating factor for states in their cyber diplomacy because the threshold of activities and operations is still pretty low in severity and exists in something of a legal gray area. And so that's been making it challenging for states when talking about this to say definitively, yes, this is an attack situation and therefore these laws should apply. Of course, this could change any time, and I feel right now there is a momentum towards increasing the possible threshold of attack or operation, but the data tells us that so far it's been beneath a certain level. And then secondly, there is this constant issue around attribution in cyberspace that doesn't necessarily exist in the physical world. And by this, I mean attributing responsibility for an activity or operation. Experts tell us that it is almost always possible to trace an operation back to its origin, but it's not always easy and certainly can't always be done as rapidly as we would like. And this is also becoming a complicating factor in diplomatic and legal efforts because it's now very possible to impact your adversary anonymously and get away with it with impunity. So, what are we doing about this whole new myriad of problems? I think I'll give sort of a similar caveat to what I gave at the opening of my remarks, that I'm really going to be talking about what's happening at the multilateral level and quite a lot about what's been happening within the UN. So if you can believe it, the UN has been considering developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security since 1998. It's now a long time ago. And I would stress the words context of international security because cyber, sort of writ large, or digital technologies, it does pop up in other parts of the UN system. The ITU, of course, is all about developing standards and technical support to member states in this area. There's been a lot of work in the human rights sphere that I probably won't have time to talk about today. But so in the context of talking about security issues coming out of the General Assembly and its first committee on disarmament and international security, this has officially been on the agenda since 1998. And in those sort of early years, what this meant was that it was a valid topic to come up with, to address, to speak to in the General Assembly, in the first committee. Shortly after that, the Secretary General had the mandate to start publishing an annual report, which he, hopefully one day she, still does, and that is comprised of submissions that are made by member states on their views on this issue. But then around 2004, the real locus of discussion started to take place in groups of governmental experts, or GGEs for short. The specific mandate of, there's been 5 GGEs since then, there's now a 6th one that will begin its work shortly, has maybe had some small variations over time, but in general, they've been put together to examine existing and potential threats in cybersphere and possible cooperative measures to address them. So as I said, there have been 5 GGEs that have been convened over the years. Most often they meet in 2-year meeting cycles, maybe 4 or 5 times a year. They have varied in size from 15 to 25 member states. And they also took place in closed sessions, so there's never really been a very good record of what these groups have discussed exactly. But what we know about them is based largely on the reports that have come out of them, which I'll come on to in a second. Each group has always sought to produce a report at the end of its proceedings, hopefully agreed to by consensus, because in the UN we love consensus. And those reports have in turn been returned to the First Committee and the General Assembly for wider endorsement by the whole UN membership. The third and the fourth of these GGEs are credited with having produced the most substantive outcomes in this regard. These were the reports that came out in 2013 and then in 2015. And what these did was they affirmed the applicability of international law, existing international law, to cyberspace, and further articulated 11 recommendations for voluntary and non-binding norms, rules, or principles for state behavior, confidence-building measures, international cooperation and capacity building, and positive actions. All of this is been put forward as a way to limit or constrain state action in cyberspace and promote cyber stability or cyber peace therein. These 11 recommendations still constitute the basis of most UN dialogue on national cybersecurity. Their implementation or operationalization have not been well adhered to. And now the question really is amongst member states, what do we do about that? How can we kind of get to a place of preaching and into practice? There was, I won't get into the details, but there was kind of a breakdown in the 5th GGE that prevented the adoption of a report that year. And then there was kind of a lost year in which nothing was really happening on this in the UN. And then last year, in probably the most contentious First Committee session I've ever been to, and others in the room who were there know too, it was not possible for member states to agree to establish one new GGE. Instead, we now have an open-ended working group, an OEWG, which is meeting concurrently as a new GGE. So there are now 2 bodies talking about nearly identical topics established by the same body. The open-ended working group had its first session in mid-September in New York. It's the more open body. It's the one that's open to the wider UN membership. It will meet once more in February and then once in July, and then it's supposed to put a report back to the GA in 2020. It will also have a intersessional session in December, which is targeted at private sector, private industry and civil society actors to get our input on board. The GGE is going to be, again, a closed unit. It's going to meet several times and put forward its report in 2021. And it does this time, though, have different mechanisms for input to it from other member states. There's like a one-time session for that. And there's also a series of regional consultations as well. So I'm just gonna, I know I'm probably getting close on time, so I think maybe what I'll do is just give a bit of a taste of what are they talking about in these groups and what are they doing, and what are the sticking points. So, the OEWG session was organized around 6 topics that I think are pretty indicative about where the thrust of conversation is in these meetings. They were existing threats, international law, rules, norms, and principles, institutional dialogue, confidence building measures, and capacity building. I feel like a lot of the conversation in these spaces tends to really, pull from what we know about disarmament and existing weapons issues, and tends to want to use the same toolbox of solutions as what we're already familiar with. People have different opinions about this, if this is a good way forward or not. For sure, international law is the biggest sticking point and bone of contention amongst member states, despite the pronouncement of the 2013 group that international law does apply in cyberspace. There are states who are questioning this or saying that no, we need new international law existing law is not sufficient. If it was, we wouldn't be having these attacks and these problems. And then within that legal question, there's an even bigger fight over the applicability of international humanitarian law, IHL. And this is an interesting thought puzzle, I often think, because, you know, I feel like many of us instinctively, we want to say, yes, IHL applies. And most states do, most Western states are proponents of this. But there are others who are cleverly arguing that, no, we can't go there, because if we say that IHL applies, then that means that we are admitting that this has become a militarized space and a zone of conflict, because IHL only applies in conflict. So by doing so, we're creating the rules of battle in cyberspace, so we shouldn't go there. And these are countries like China, like Cuba, like Russia. And so it's been interesting to try to make the case that no, like we need to be thinking about IHL when they're kind of coming back at us with our own arguments against militarization of cyberspace. And then maybe just to quickly, just to say that, yeah, this is, again, like I said, this is like reflective of the conversation that's been happening in the security area of the UN, but inaction there, much like Paul said in his presentation on outer space, is leading to action by other actors. And now there's actually 2 or 3 other global fora working with member states to articulate norms of behavior for governments in cyberspace. There's also a lot of private sector initiatives that are happening. And so these UN bodies are going to need to reconcile what's happening out in the wider world, and also what's been happening in the human rights community to protect our offline rights online. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Courtney. Hello, everybody. Listen, it's a great pleasure to be on this panel with my esteemed colleague Alexandra, and nice to see Alison, who, to tell tales out of school, literally was a former student of mine at the University of Toronto. But when she was a student and when I was an instructor, I don't think either of us were talking about cybersecurity. I'm going to start with because everybody's talked about cybersecurity being in the news, as it always is, but I want to begin with a story which is very much in the news, which may just have escaped your attention. The story has to do with the transcript, the released transcript of the presidential chat, President Trump's chat with the newly elected Ukrainian leader, Mr. Zelensky. And there is a cybersecurity angle to this, which you know, who knows what may have a good outcome for the world. But I'm just going to read you a couple of lines from the relevant portion of the transcript. This is President Trump. Sorry, I can't imitate the voice. I would like you to do us a favor. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people. The server, they say Ukraine has it. There are a lot of things that went on, the whole situation. And I'll skip a few lines. Very poor performance by a man named Robert Mueller, an incompetent performance. But they say a lot of it started with Ukraine. Whatever you can do, it's very important that you do it, if that's possible. Now, I'm going to now quote with apologies for the profanity, which it's just a quote. From Vice News' media report on this portion of the transcript, where the Vice News reporter says, again, quotes, honestly, who knows what the fuck Trump is actually trying to say. For those of you who didn't follow in intimate detail the 2016 Russian election hack or the Mueller report, just by way of quick context, CrowdStrike is an American cybersecurity firm not owned by a wealthy Ukrainian, not based in Ukraine. It's actually where all cybersecurity firms grow up, which is in California, with an office in Arlington, which is also the usual practice in the States. For those of you who know the Washington region, you'll understand why. CrowdStrike does not have a server in Ukraine. It's not hiding a server in Ukraine. And CrowdStrike also went on the record as saying that a previous tweet that President Trump had released accusing them of being part of the deep state was also untrue. CrowdStrike was a cybersecurity firm hired by the Democratic National Convention when they discovered that, Democratic National Committee, sorry, when they discovered that their servers had been hacked into by somebody unknown. CrowdStrike really was the first firm in on that story who uncovered the links back to Russian operatives, and they turned over all of their analysis and material to the FBI. And CrowdStrike is prominently mentioned in Robert Mueller's report in, I'm told, I didn't double check this, I apologize, 4 footnotes. Anyway, the purpose of my story here is that cybersecurity genuinely is always in the news, sometimes in surprising ways. It's a perilous topic for the uninitiated, and it is, of course, rife with political mythology and mischief. So here, I thought, in the time allocated, I would try and do 4 quick things, including referencing the title of this panel, which someone dreamed up. The first is really just a few general thoughts on the current characteristics of the cyber domain. The second is to give you a little bit of a tour of Five Eyes, that is the Intelligence Alliance's current cyber threat assessments. A third, just to talk very briefly about a synthesis of where the current dangers lie. And then finally, a brief and super optimistic assessment of the answer to the question of whether we're heading into the abyss. So let me give you 9 current characteristics, which I'll just rhyme them off very quickly, and if there's time in the conversation, if people are interested, we can come back to them. But here's my 9. One is offense has the advantage over defense at the moment. These are the characteristics of the cyber domain. Cyber attack tools are ubiquitous and increasingly accessible. In the jargon of the cybersecurity world, what are called attack surfaces are expanding. That is, all the different targets you can go after technologically. There is a wide range of threat actors and targets. State actors still possess by far the most powerful capabilities, but some state actors leverage other actors at the non-state level. State actors themselves are a prominent target of cyber threats. Deterrence is difficult to non-existent. Again, this is all at the moment. International norms and rules are weak and may fracture, kind of just to support some of the things that Alison had to say. Escalation looms. Public understanding is limited. Alarmism is easy. And here's the counterintuitive one. Cybersecurity, potentially counterintuitive, cybersecurity and the preservation of democratic values are fusing in the face of the multiplicity of cyber threats. And I'll come back to that reflection. So, Five Eyes tour. All members, I'm just going to assume that people have some basic understanding of what the Five Eyes are. All members of the Five Eyes, that is Canada, US, Australia, UK, New Zealand, have signals intelligence agencies that have developed cyber offensive and defensive capabilities. Many of them also have a mandate to engage with the private sector and the public to enhance cybersecurity. These agencies are also, in the last few years, the source of public threat assessment reporting on cyber dangers. And all of these threat assessments are available on the web from official websites. So what are the current round of threat assessments from the main cybersecurity, cyber intelligence agencies in the Five Eyes? What do they look like? What do they say? The US presents the cyber threat as follows. High-level concern with ransomware attacks, and there has been a high-level concern with those kinds of attacks since the May 2017 WannaCry incident. Plus, also very much in the higher reaches of their concerns and priorities, what is called among the Five Eyes the Big Four. And the Big Four, these are aggressive cyber actors who use a variety of tools in an adversarial way. The Big Four are Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Not necessarily in that order. You probably have to juggle Russia and China depending on the circumstances, but those are the top 2. The Big Four of that league all use cyber capabilities for different ends, but both China and Russia are major cyber espionage actors. And the most recent statement from a senior official at the National Security Agency in the US indicated that the Americans are now fielding some 4,000 ransomware attacks per day. The most recent UK threat assessment Again, references explicitly the Big Four as a threat. Again, references concerns about cyber crime, calling this a growing and underestimated threat, which is described by the head of UK National Cyber Security Centre, a man named Kieran Martin, as high volume, low sophistication, rampant, ubiquitous, transnational cyber crime. Lots of adjectives, I think all of them probably appropriate. Let me switch to the smallest of the Five Eyes countries, New Zealand, which also publishes cyber threat assessment reports in public. The concern of New Zealand, Australia, Canada is slightly differently phrased when it comes to threat assessments among the five. I'll start with New Zealand. In their most recent cyber threat assessment, they talk about the concerns that impact on them most being a combination of cyber espionage, cyber crime, and influence and interference operations. And their agency has identified that as many as 40% of the cyber attacks that target tiny New Zealand are state-sponsored. The Australians also talk about cybercrime, also talk about ransomware as a prime threat. They also talk about cyber espionage. And as a main concern for Australia, among the Five Eyes, in their kind of statistical accounting, what they've seen in recent years and months is that 56% of the identified cyber attacks target Australian industry, 20% of the attacks target the Australian federal government and its institutions, and obviously particularly the security and intelligence agencies directly. Canada, last but not least, necessarily of the Five Eyes, actually has produced the best and most current cyber threat assessment. And this is a report I think worth paying attention to. It's professional, it's slick, but it's also substantive, and it does have some interesting things to say in terms of where the Canadian security community believes attention should really be paid. The most recent threat assessment update from the Communication Security Establishment states that cyber crime, I quote, is the cyber threat most likely to affect Canadians and Canadian businesses in 2019. It also describes cyber espionage as a persistent and growing threat, and it downplays the prospect of what is loosely referred to as cyber war. It says that quasi-warlike attacks, particularly on critical infrastructure, are unlikely, and are unlikely especially in the absence of the onset of any kind of conventional military conflict. So a quick synthesis of all of this reporting. There's lots of commonalities among the Five Eyes in their outlooks on cyber threats, and I don't think this is a product of what can be called circular reporting. It's not that everybody is reinforcing somebody else's views in intelligence sources, but there are also some interesting differences in threat rankings. The two biggest powers in the Five Eyes, the UK and the United States, are more globally focused, more concerned about global state actor threats from the Big Four. UK and the US all agree about the threat and the nature of the threat posed by that so-called Big Four. Again, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and they all agree on the diversity of that set of states' uses of cyber instruments and aims. All of the Five Eyes, though, do agree on the prominence of cybercrime as a major, major threat, and all agree on the persistence and dangers posed by cyber espionage. Cybercrime, cyber espionage, state actors. That's the combination. So, the coming abyss. Here's my optimism. So I would say, first of all, hold on. Don't let your hair go on fire. Defensive I promise I'll finish well before our time is up. Defensive capabilities. Cyber defense. We'll strive for equilibrium. There's a lot of work being put into cyber defense, and it may well get there, so that there is a kind of balance between offense and defense, which will be very helpful in all kinds of ways. Attribution campaigns, or what we might refer to as public and private calling out, and restrained, I put that in brackets, state hacking back, as it's called, will induce caution in state behavior, probably long before anything by way of the emergence of international norms, laws, or rules will achieve that objective. Calling out, restrain, hacking back will induce caution in state behavior, and I think will lead to the emergence of some deterrence and weak norms impacts. Cyber war, here's the really good news, will not happen. It won't happen certainly as a standalone. Cyber war will be exercised in the context of it being one kind of warfighting instrument in the mix of other warfighting instruments if war happens. It's not going to be a standalone weapon ever. Cyber covert operations, which is another favorite topic of mine, but we don't have time to go into it, will be seen as a limited utility, hard to control, hard to know, potential backlash from. Influence and interference operations, again, my optimistic prediction is that these will largely fail and disappoint their sponsors, and I think this has been the short record of such operations since 2016, when the Russians had their successes with the American election campaign. The thing I take greatest comfort from so far in the post-2016 record is the response of the French system to Russian election interference in the French campaigns in 2017, which deployed a very dangerous Gallic weapon, which was a sense of humor. But cyber espionage will be a persistent problem. The Great Game 2.0 is a cyber-dominated game, and cybercrime will get worse before it gets better. So, where are we headed with all this? Very quickly, the rise of cybercrime will require domestic and global cybercrime busting. J. Edgar Hoover with a supercomputer. There will have to be a much stronger emphasis on law enforcement in dealing with cybercrime, and incidentally, Canada has just been dealt a very serious setback in that regard with the Cameron Otis affair. Cyber will dominate as an espionage tool. Cyber espionage will enjoy a long run as a form of taking candy from babies, especially in attacks, espionage attacks on sensitive commercial sectors. But global cyber espionage will also kickstart new concepts of economic security and critical infrastructure and its protection. Cybersecurity efforts by governments, and this is an if, and some of you will regard it as a very big if seen as lawful and effective, will solidify social license for national security and intelligence agencies. And my last point is that cybersecurity will be embraced as vital for the maintenance of democracy. Thanks.